Hello, today I'm thinking about gardens in books. When I was reading The Lover Upon Trial, there's a scene in that where the main character drew a picture of her garden. And it occurred to me that what she called a garden is really different to what we view as a garden today in a house, what we expect to find in a house. So when I was outside watering my plants, that started me thinking about gardens in books in general and what I like and when you see them and common features of them. And so I thought I'd talk about it because that's what I've been thinking about. The first thing I was thinking was that most books with gardens in them are not modern books. You do see gardens featuring in books from as recent as the 1980s, but you don't see them much in books from this decade or last, not that I've found anyway. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking that that makes sense because we don't have gardens the way we used to. And I know here where I live, in my state of Australia, it's really common for people to build very big houses on smallish blocks of land. It's like any space that you can have for your house is preferred over space that you would turn into a garden. So if you've got any garden whatsoever, you've just got a little strip maybe at the front of the house that looks a bit decorative. And it seems to be part of the sales pitch is that a garden is low maintenance. So if you've only lived in modern houses, chances are you haven't really seen gardens the way they used to be. And when I was looking through the books, the gardens that you got in, say, the 1980s were immensely different from the gardens that you got 100 years earlier. And I think along with the change in the use of the ground around a house, from being a garden to being car parking space and just an area to keep out weeds, I think the symbolism of gardens in books is inevitably going to finish as well. And so I was thinking about what that symbolism really is as I see it. And I'm not terribly good with things like symbolism. To me, it's different for all people. Something that I get out of a book is going to be very different to something someone else gets out of a book. So all I can talk about here is the way I see it, the way it works for me, because it really depends on what experiences you've had in the past as to how something is going to affect you, as to how you're going to visualise anything in a story. But I do think there were some common features in the books that I liked that had gardens in them. And so I thought I'd just talk about that. My next thought was that most fictional books set predominantly in gardens are for children. That makes sense, especially for books that are at least 50 years old, because for many children the garden was the extent of their world. If you were a writer for children, you'd probably set your book somewhere that children would recognise instantly and understand and relate to. And I can see the further trouble you might have having decided on the garden as a setting, when you're then going to think, how can I make this story interesting? What can I put in it that's different from what everybody else is writing about? And you've got a very limited, carefully constrained world that's designed to be perfectly safe. So how do you spice that up? So that was one thing I was thinking about, was the ways that writers did this when they've got stories about gardens. I think there's two ways that this is done in children's stories. One is it's a story about healing and a story about growth and a story about renewal. And a good example of this is Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden. That's the story of an orphan girl who becomes the ward of a reclusive uncle in England. She finds herself alone in a very big empty house. She's cared for by a couple of servants, and she discovers a secret garden in the grounds of the mansion. It's one of my favourite stories ever, and I love the BBC TV show of that too. I actually haven't found a movie version of it that I like. I don't feel that any of the movies managed to portray that sense of loneliness that she felt, or that sense of complete lostness in a world that was basically just ignoring her, going on around her. But the book was absolutely brilliant. I did love that. In that book, the gardens were massive. They were acres upon acres upon acres of gardens. This wasn't just a little backyard plot. The other sort of children's literature about gardens are time travel books. And I think that's really interesting that so many authors chose to go that path. The best example I can think of this is Tom's Midnight Garden, which is another book that I absolutely loved. I really enjoyed the BBC production of that, the BBC TV series of that too. Tom's Midnight Garden was the story of a boy who is sent to stay with his aunt and uncle in a manor house that has been converted into flats. It's a very dull, dreary place for a child, and once again he has no friends around. But when the clock strikes 13, he is taken back in time to a decade when the manor house is a whole house with extensive gardens, and he meets a girl who lives there and they form friendship. But Tom's Midnight Garden wasn't the only one that did that. There was also Antonia Barber's The Ghosts, which I read as a child as well. That was the story of two children just at the end of World War I who, with their mother, go to live in the caretaker's cottage on the extensive grounds of what is now a destroyed house. It's a burned hulk of house. They meet two children who lived there 100 years earlier, and the children are in danger, so the two more recent children go back in time to help the earlier children. I really like that one, not only because of the time travel aspects and the children and the fantastic gardens, but we also get a glimpse of 3 centuries. The children are exactly 100 years apart. The earlier pair is in 1818, the later pair is in 1918. So watching it today, when we are so close to 2018, means that we're seeing the differences between 3 centuries, and they've done it very well. This one has also been adapted for the screen. There is a 1972 movie called The Amazing Mr. Blunden, which is based on this book. The movie is quite close to the book, and I think it does capture the mood very well. I do have a slight problem with the logical inconsistency in the time travel plot, and usually that is a big problem for me. It was a problem for me with the book, but it's such a great story and the characters are so good that I was able to overlook that. And I don't have to completely overlook it. There are ways that you can make it work. I just don't think they explained that well in the book. That is the only criticism I have of The Ghosts. Fantastic story, a very nice garden. And like both The Secret Garden and Tom's Midnight Garden, you get to see a garden in its different stages. You get to see the severe neglect of a garden that's not actually dying but gone dormant. Or in the case of Tom's Midnight Garden, it has been bulldozed and turned into houses. Or you get to see the garden in its prime and what a magical place it is. And I think that's part of it. I think that's part of the decline of gardens in the world, people remembering the beauty of the gardens in their childhood with all that nostalgic tint that makes them even better than they were. When I was thinking about it, I was thinking that there's sort of more to it than that, because you do actually get more garden time travel stories than you do house time travel stories. There are a few of those out there, but they don't seem to work as well. Part of that is because gardens just last longer and they can be returned to what they were much more easily than a house can, which is what you see in The Ghosts. The movie does really well to capture that same feel of the grounds and the excitement of exploring a place that just seems to be sleeping. It's a sort of a nature's sleeping beauty waiting to be woken up. I guess with a garden that seems more attainable, that you can recover a garden in the way you can't a house. But I think it also comes down to as I said earlier, the garden is the world of children, and that makes it the world of safety. And so I sort of think it's a story about safety is in danger. I know that sounds really strange, but my third example of gardens with time travel is the Green Knowe series, which has a boy who comes to stay with his grandmother, and for this series it's both the house and the garden, but the magic is in the garden. When Tolly comes to stay with his grandmother, he meets the former occupants of the house everywhere on the grounds and in the house, but he did meet them first in the garden. The garden is a large part of this. So I think that just about covers garden in fiction for children. When I went to look at adult literature, it was a bit harder. There are certainly gardens in many books, particularly in classics, Very often the garden is a place where something happened, something with plot significance. I know that the garden is sometimes considered to be a religious analogy. I don't think that's always true, and I don't really think that fits for most of the books that I read. But it certainly seems to be a place where communication occurs, such as Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth coming to an understanding in the garden at Longbourn. And the scenes at the start of A Room with a View where they're in the garden, particularly the scene where the mother, whose name I can't remember right now, is tying up her roses because the wind is wrecking them, which I've always felt was a sort of analogy for her own children who are now at the mercy of emotional turmoil in their newly adult lives, and the mother not being able to protect them, partly because she hasn't planted them in the right places with the right supports. That, of course, is just my own reading of it. Sometimes the most blatant symbolism and imagery passes me by completely. That's what I saw in that one. Most of the books that I have about gardens that are adult books are actually horror books where things go wrong in the garden. For instance, this one's not very new, but The Day of the Triffids. The Triffids were a plant that people were introducing to their gardens. It became quite a fashionable thing to have a Triffid in your garden. And the Triffids turned out to be deadly because once humans lost their sight, the Triffids would take them out. It's pretty clear in this book that the garden was just the analogy for England. And what John Wyndham was saying was that when England harboured their agreements with other countries and they had scientific trades for biological warfare, they were actually introducing great danger into England. I don't think that was his conscious message, but that's kind of clearly the background, isn't it? That the Triffids came in as a mysterious, benign feature that everybody took into their domestic worlds and then they were destroyed by it. And everybody had one in their gardens. So the death toll was colossal. And I do think this is what you see a lot in horror books, that nasty things will happen in the gardens in horrors, and that adds to the horror element because the garden is a place that we know to be safe and health-giving. Having come to that thought, I was thinking about why we've changed. Putting aside things like land values and the fact that everybody's at work and nobody is around to maintain the garden, and obviously there's all that in it. There are pragmatic factors like that in there. But apart from that, we don't even really want them anymore, do we? People are kind of happy with a pot plant or two. And maybe I just think this because where I live, I've just got red dirt in the backyard. I grew up in a place where it rained a lot, where everything just grew all the time. And I also grew up on all this literature about gardens, so maybe it's inevitable that here in my dry, dusty outback town, I'm going to start thinking very fondly of gardens. But I don't think I'm alone in that. I think that's just a trend that we've got going at the moment. And then I went on to think about how we've shifted away from the garden as a setting in fiction. Why don't we have books about gardens anymore? I'm not the only one that still does a lot of gardening, that still loves gardens. Why is it that we don't have a ton of literature out there about this facet of life that seems to have just vanished in the last 30 or 40 years? When you see gardens these days, it's not really for the garden itself. It's not about being involved with the garden. It's just what you're doing in it. It's like barbecues or playing tennis or having people around. That's not a real connection with the ground. And then I was thinking that the garden was actually the place for anybody who was disempowered in any way. Gardens were a sort of jail because they weren't just for children. They were for people with disabilities, people with illnesses, people who were very poor and had to work as servants, people with mental health problems, women of all classes. The garden was a place of healing for some, but for others it was nothing more than a jail. And I think that's probably why literature moved beyond it, because nobody wants to be constrained to a sphere like that, and rightly not. But I still think it's a bit of a shame, because a garden is a great place to retire to. It's a great place to get away from the worries and fears of the world. I guess it just comes down to anything can be turned. And I hope that the trend will change, and someday soon we will see a lot more books coming out involving gardens. And that's really all I wanted to say here. If anybody knows any really good books involving gardens, do let me know in the comments. and I'll go read them. Thank you for watching.